So Call of Duty Vanguard is nearly here, and we're almost ready to say goodbye to Black Ops Cold War, a game that over the last 12 months has given us some highs and definitely some lows. I'm going to break down the noobs' feelings on the game, and whether it's been a success across campaign, multiplayer and zombies. As I'm going through each topic, let me know in the comments below if you agree or if you feel differently. It's very easy to look at the success of a title based on the financials, and we're all aware of how well Call of Duty does in this area. Black Ops Cold War was the best-selling game in the US in 2020, selling 5.7 million copies in its first month, and within 6 weeks of the game's release, it had earned nearly $700 million. But aside from the obvious financial successes, was Cold War actually a good game? So where better to start than with the campaign? And we definitely start on a high here with what was a pretty impressive campaign. Campaigns are a little bit like mustard. You either love them or you hate them. And a campaign can often only go as far as the pre-scripted missions, where you don't really have any control over what happens. But this did feel a little bit different with Cold War. The ability to affect the outcome of the story through two avenues really immersed you in the gameplay. The first of these was your persona, where you could set background and personality traits for your character, even giving yourself a name, and this helped you feel a little bit more in control of painting the picture. The second of these was in-game decisions, and you could see this right from the outset of the campaign, where you found yourself grabbing an informant and threatening to throw him off the roof if he didn't give you the information that you were looking for. You could then decide to let him live, or condemn him to the mercy of the pavement below. This choice-making mechanic shapes future decisions and outcomes throughout the campaign, and moved away from a purely scripted mentality. If you're then the type of person who likes playing campaigns more than once, you could take alternate routes second time around. I always felt with video game campaigns that it's a little bit like you're watching a movie. And while you're clicking buttons and moving around, ultimately you're still seeing what everybody else sees. But with this mechanic, you're able to pause that movie and decide who lived and who died, whether the movie took a positive or a sinister turn. And this personal campaign experience also spills through to the safe house, where you could walk around and interact with characters, as well as being able to select which mission was most appropriate to tackle next. The graphics are also pretty decent in the campaign, and it had a lot to live up to from Modern Warfare. If you recall the Clean House mission from Modern Warfare, which was incredibly immersive, moving through that London townhouse with night vision goggles, Cold War does do well to carry on that impressive graphical representation. Inevitably, a COD campaign is a COD campaign. You're always going to be running around and shooting bad guys, but this one, as I said, did feel a little bit different. Immersive, personal and fun. For the campaign, we give a score of 8 out of 10. Moving on then from the campaign, let's discuss multiplayer. This has long since been the cornerstone of any Call of Duty title, especially given aspects of COD games like zombies don't appear every time, and so as a result you tend to expect a lot more from multiplayer regardless of whichever COD you're playing. Before we get into discussing the gameplay, Cold War's lifetime was weighed down somewhat within the player community, who disagreed on the time to kill elements, as well as the highly controversial skill-based matchmaking. There was also a significant issue on launch for several months where the next-gen Xbox consoles were having issues, crashing whenever players would try and get into a game, and many felt the reaction times of the devs to address these types of issues were quite slow. Aside from those issues though, I didn't really feel all that invested in the gameplay in multiplayer. The mechanics were quite clunky, and there were a lot of the finer details, such as being able to mount surfaces to lean around corners and change the fire rate on your weapons, that were missing from Cold War. If you compare its predecessor, Modern Warfare, where you had these little details and much more, Cold War just felt a little bit rushed and unpolished in that sense. In terms of game modes within multiplayer, there were plenty to choose from in Cold War, and on the Noobs channel we made a lot of content based around how to play Game Mode X, with advice, tips and tricks to getting the most out of those modes. A lot of the comments we would get on such videos, however, were that people were no longer able to see such game modes in the playlists, I think the positive of having so many game modes available actually created a negative situation, whereby to accommodate new modes on the playlists, existing modes would rotate out, sometimes for weeks or months at a time. So from one day to the next, you could really be enjoying something like Prop Hunt, only for it to disappear. I do feel like towards the end of Cold War's lifecycle, this has been addressed somewhat, with sub-playlists being created, and party games being a good example, that has things like Sticks and Stones, Prop Hunt, etc. underneath it. But this was a frustrating aspect of multiplayer. Some of those modes that would come in to replace the popular existing ones often failed to deliver as well. VIP Escort is a good example. It didn't really work as a game mode in COD, and rounds were often over pretty quickly without the objective being achieved. Without doubt the biggest fail in terms of game modes was Double Agent. Styled on an Among Us theme, with players having to gather clues to figure out who the double agents were, and this did not go down remotely well with the community. The format of COD just didn't work with this fact-finding, clue-based style of play. Matches would often descend into farce, with toxic players who had been placed into a match as an operative to support the detective immediately killing their teammates. As with any of the issues within COD Cold War, the devs did attempt to address this, making the mode melee only, but it does highlight that a lot of the modes that came through as the game progressed could be considered a failure. All in all, multiplayer wasn't a disaster, but we felt a lot of improvements could be made, like the frustrating and needlessly long best play camera at the end of a round, as opposed to just having a quick final kill replay alternative. Based on that, we'd give multiplayer a somewhat disappointing score of 5.5 out of 10. So that brings us on to the final topic to review, which is of course zombies. As I mentioned, not every COD title gets treated to a zombies mode, and so when one does come around, it's a big plus for the community who invest their time into playing it. On a high level, we'd say that zombies was pretty well put together in Cold War, but let's discuss why we think that. Firstly, the maps were well thought out, and you could invest a lot of playing time into them before they got stale. There were also relatively frequent updates from the devs in the form of Easter eggs to keep the community engaged. In terms of the main maps, we had 4 over the course of Cold War in the form of D Machine, Firebase C, Mauer de Toten, and Forsaken. I'd say Mauer de Toten was the most complete of the 4, but you may have a different view. These maps were well thought out and had plenty to keep players busy. Firebase C in particular had a lot of potential as a new zombies map, but was somewhat overshadowed by the popular Outbreak mode. In fact, Firebase C had only been available for a few weeks when Outbreak dropped, and inevitably this took both the devs and the community's focus and attention away from what was a solid map. And of course, we can't not review Outbreak. It was a pretty revolutionary way of playing zombies, and for us it was a big success. It offered an alternative view to the typical round-based maps, and a more user-controlled way of making their way through a zombies match at their own pace. Admittedly, towards the end of Cold War, it has gotten a little bit stale, and although new maps are added to the rotation, the mechanics of the mode have been rinsed and repeated, but this is inevitable with any mode. All in all, we'd give zombies a score of 7.5 out of 10. So where does this leave us? Given our overall ratings, it comes out to an average of 7 out of 10. Whilst Cold War excelled in campaign and was solid in zombies, we feel that multiplayer let it down quite considerably. But what do you think? Do you agree with our ratings? And is there anything that we didn't mention that you think deserves one? Whether that's gameplay or mechanics, or do you feel we're way off with our scores? There's no right or wrong answers, so we want to hear down below in the comments what you think of Cold War. Take care guys, and I'll catch you in the next one.